we begin our discussion of all of this with someone who would be in that meeting with the Inspector General tomorrow if she still had her old job at the House Intelligence Committee. Mika Owyang is a former staff member of the House Intelligence Committee and is now Vice President of the National Security Program at Third Way. Also joining us is Evelyn Farkas. She's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration and served on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee for 7 years. She's an MSNBC national security analyst, and we're joined by former Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri. Senator McCaskill was a member of the Finance Committee, the Armed Services Committee, and was the ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee. Senator McCaskill is now an MSNBC political analyst. And Senator, let me start with you. This request by the Inspector General is to meet with the committee staff. Surely committee members would be welcome in the meeting, but the fact that they are on recess means that most members are not in Washington. This is a request to meet with the Republican staff, the Democratic staff of all of these committees, House and Senate combined. It's maybe the largest collection of committee staff that will ever be gathered in one room at one time. What is your reading of this situation tonight with the State Department?
Well, I think it's really interesting. First of all, Steve Linick, let me give you some context. Steve Linick is a former DOJ prosecutor, spent a lot of time in fraud and corruption trials, which are paper-intensive trials. Those are the kinds of cases that are built on documents. And so he understands the importance of documents. The fact that he is bringing documents, that means that something is in those documents that he thinks it's really important that the people who are doing this impeachment inquiry see immediately. So it will be very interesting to see what we find out tomorrow. But this is very unusual for an inspector general to do this. I worked with a lot of inspectors general. I did a lot of legislation, ironically, with Chuck Grassley on whistleblowers and inspectors general. And for an inspector general to step up like this, because typically they want to go through protocol and procedures, means something big is up.
Mika Owyang, you'd be in the room tomorrow if you still had your old job. This might be one of those days when you wish you had it. Let's start with what this isn't, okay? This is the Inspector General who's asking for this meeting. So this would not be a follow-up, in effect, to Secretary Pompeo's letter, in which Secretary Pompeo is raising questions about the classification of some of these documents and the availability of some of these documents. If that's what the State Department was concerned about, it would have been counsel to the Secretary or someone in the Secretary's chain of command. Because it's coming from the Inspector General, what does that say to you?
So what that says to me is this is different than the document request that went forward from the members of the committee earlier to Pompeo, where they listed out witnesses, including Kurt Volker, and said, we need to talk to these people about what Secretary Pompeo heard on the call with the president of Ukraine. Now, there are so many things that have been happening inside the State Department. It's sort of hard to predict what exactly this Inspector General is bringing forward here. Is it about the subversion of the regular policymaking process? Is this about some attempt to intimidate? Is there another whistleblower inside the State Department? But what's very clear is that this Inspector General is taking his independence very seriously, and he is bringing forward things that we may not have heard of before into this conversation.
And Evelyn, this Inspector General, to fill out his bio that Senator McCaskill began, he was appointed by President Obama, so that, of course, will provoke Trump world into thinking, oh, he's biased. He is the Inspector General who supervised the report within the State Department Inspector General's office on Hillary Clinton's email that actually was highly critical of Hillary Clinton's use of email at the State Department, said that she, in fact, did not comply with the Federal Records Act, found that violation very, very clearly in his report about her email. And so that's the last big moment that we heard from this Inspector General in 2016.
Right. And Lawrence, I think it's interesting because whatever he's bringing forward, I think it's not only different, but it probably pertains to the Secretary of State, if not the president himself. Why do I say this? Because I don't know if this is news or not, but the Department of Defense is also doing I understand that there is an IG investigation occurring also at DOD, and they're looking at what happened with regard to the freezing of the Ukrainian funds. How did the department respond? The background to that. That Inspector General hasn't taken it upon himself or herself to rush over urgently to the Hill. So again, this seems like a counter move to that Pompeo letter where Secretary Pompeo said, I'm not letting my personnel basically go and speak to the independent branch of government that has the right to talk to them. And if they go, they have to go with State Department minders, to basically intimidate them into maybe not telling Congress as much as they know. So it seems to me that this IG meeting is now the counter move from the State Department, from State Department experts and senior personnel.
Yeah, let's all keep in mind the sequence today of these big events involving the State Department. There was the Pompeo letter to the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House saying, will not make these witnesses or documents available. Then, after that, and only after that, came the Inspector General's urgent request. And then that other letter that I was reporting on from the three chairmen, that came much later tonight after the Inspector General. So the Inspector General was coming into this story after the Pompeo letter denying the access to the witnesses and the documents. Let's take a look at Mike Pompeo's compromised position in this story involving the phone call with the president of Ukraine. Let's listen to what he said last week when he was asked about a phone call that no one knew then Mike Pompeo actually listened in on. And we now know Mike Pompeo listened in on. Let's listen to the way he reacted to questions about that last week.
So you just gave me a report about a high-seek whistleblower campaign, none of which I've seen.
So, Matt, I haven't had a chance to actually read the whistleblower complaint yet. I read the first couple of paragraphs and then got busy today. But I'll ultimately get a chance to see it. If I understand it right, it's from someone who had secondhand knowledge.
So now you know what Mike Pompeo looks like when he's not telling the truth. Let's listen to what he had to say today in Italy when he was asked about this.
Mr. Secretary, do you have any comment on reports you're on the July 25th call with President Zelensky?
Senator McCaskill, the new technique for Mike Pompeo when he's asked about this is turn and walk in the other direction.
Yeah, and his boss is not going to be happy about that because clearly Mike Pompeo is beginning to look after Mike Pompeo instead of Donald Trump. He is thinking about his future. Because if he was doing what Trump wants him to do, he should have wheeled on the camera and said it was a perfect call. I heard it. He didn't do that. He is being careful. He was lying by omission, by not admitting at that moment to Martha Raddatz that he was on the call. And today, he is once again stonewalling and stiffing the constitutional requirement that he cooperate and provide transparent information in an impeachment inquiry.
Mika, take us inside that room tomorrow when the Inspector General is going to be meeting. First of all, this meeting is as unprecedented to you as it is to me, right? I mean, you've never seen anything like this.
I've never seen anything like this. But look, we've never had a president who is so clearly at the center of a misconduct allegation like this. We've never seen this before.
What can you imagine the Inspector General from state is bringing that is of interest to all of these different committees? His normal relationship would be only to the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Right. Well, it's very clear all of these committees are involved in the impeachment inquiry, that it was a complaint that came in from an intelligence whistleblower, and it is about the president holding up this aid to Ukraine as a way of pressuring the Ukrainian government to dig up and manufacture a story on his most feared rival. So what we could see from this Inspector General is additional corroborating evidence in the possession of the State Department about the process by which the aid was held up. State Department plays an important role in the distribution of foreign military aid. It could be about the ways in which Pompeo is trying to hold back these witnesses. There are any number of things where the Inspector General may have the goods on the inside machinations of the Trump administration.
And Evelyn, we've seen on the first the Intelligence Committee's, the Intelligence Community's Inspector General filing that whistleblower report with the House Committee. We saw that process. It was paper. It was just the Inspector General carefully wrote basically a cover letter to a carefully written whistleblower report and passed the paper along. That Inspector General didn't jump in the car and race over to the House Intelligence Committee. This is an inspector general saying, I need to come in and see you right away. There's no time to handle this on paper, apparently.
Well, that's interesting, Lawrence, because it may mean that this inspector general has more paper. And I think Senator McCaskill also alluded to this earlier. You know, the whistleblower probably saw a lot of paper, and certainly a lot of paper was very fastidiously described in great detail, I should say, not to use too long words here, to the whistleblower. So the whistleblower knew exactly what he or she was writing about. But it seems that it's possible that this State Department IG has documents that he is afraid maybe will get destroyed or spirited away or something of that nature. And that's why this is urgent. Because remember, in another context, I mean, we're having all these fights going on in the courts. I can't even keep track of them. Rachel keeps really good track of them, and you do. But one of these fights has to do with the State Department holding on to, and the government holding on to critical information pertaining to this impeachment. So he may be worried that Secretary Pompeo or someone else might somehow demand that he turn over important documents.
And Senator McCaskill, I've been sitting here for the last couple of weeks thinking, when did Donald Trump first hear the words Inspector General? You know that it was something he did not know existed in the government until he'd been in there for a while. And here it is coming down to the Inspectors General.
Yeah, in fact, at the beginning of his administration, there was a little kerfuffle about some of the people in transition trying to get rid of all the inspectors general to get their people in. And guess who raised his hand and said, no, you can't do that? None other than Chuck Grassley.
Yes, because he's been strong on whistleblower issues and
Always.
all that. Yeah, and we're actually going to talk about that later in this hour. Senator Claire McCaskill, Evelyn Farkas, Mika Ouyang, thank you all for starting us off on this important night. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.